For antiwar.com and Chaos Radio 95.9 in Austin, Texas, I'm Scott Horton. This is Anti-War Radio. So the big news is that Karl Roves is putting out a book, or has put out a book, saying, yeah, we lied you into war, but it was an accident. It was bad intelligence. We never would have done the war if we didn't think that Saddam Hussein was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. And so rather than letting him get away with that extra lie piled on top of the previous pile of lies, I figured I would bring Larisa Alexandrovna, the managing editor of investigative news at RawStory.com, on the show to help me with a little bit of revisionist history here. Welcome back to the show, Larisa. How have you been?
I've been good. Thanks for having me.
Well, I really appreciate you joining me here. So, you tell me, is Karl Roves right that they accidentally lied us into war?
No, he's a liar. Karl Roves was the chairman of the White House Iraq Group. The acronym is WIG. Their sole purpose was to sell the war to the public.
All right. Well, so what indications do you have? I guess let's start in chronological order. Who wanted regime change, and when did they get started on pushing regime change in Iraq?
They wanted Iraq even before Bush got into office. And we know from Bush's Treasury Secretary, Paul O'Neill, that day one in office, they were looking for a way to go after Iraq. I mean, they already had the policy, you know. This was not something new. They were trying to find ways. Even on 9/11, the first thing was not to determine who actually attacked us, but how to tie this to Iraq. We know that from Richard Clark. We know that Wolfowitz and Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld were busy trying to implicate Iraq in this. So they already were adamant about going to Iraq, but we also know from the Downing Street memos, which were notes that of a meeting that the Bush administration had with the then Tony Blair administration, that they were going to, quote, fix the facts around the policy. So if you have a policy and you're determined to somehow use, you know, what happened to us in order to initiate that policy, and we further know that you're willing to fix information around that policy, that is to say, find intelligence, cook it, whatever, that's not an accident. I mean, it's impossible to call that an accident, you know? And so many ways that they messed up. I mean, how many ways can you take the wrong intelligence over and over and over before it starts to look suspicious?
All right, well, so now let's get into some of this because, you know, despite what, well, I'll tell you a story, actually, to set up the rest of this. I know a guy who I hadn't known him in a long time, and I knew him again, and I had a talk with him, and this guy was like, it was like reading Glenn Reynolds' blog for 4 years straight or something. It was like every single lie and every single bit of mis and disinformation put out by the Bush government about what they were doing with Iraq. This guy had completely memorized and knew it as well as you know the truth, Larisa, and had this whole thing where, well, the weapons are in Syria and just every little bit of it. So it occurs to me that that's kind of strange in the age of the internet when for years and years in a row now we've known the truth. There's been tons of reporting about the Office of Special Plans, for example, and the neocon cabal inside the Vice President's office and the Pentagon and et cetera like that. So, but there are still people who believe that George Bush was basically right, but the Syrians got the mustard gas now or something.
Well, I mean, there's people who believe that Iraq attacked us in 9/11. You know, you're never going to correct all the misconceptions, especially when Fox News and those kinds of outlets are working so hard to make sure that that misconception stays.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, so let's go through in detail about what these different accusations were. Let's start with what Bush was ending with in that clip from his Cincinnati speech from, I think it's October, November 2002, about the unmanned aerial vehicles. What intelligence did they have about that? Did they know they were lying about that?
You know, I don't know if they know they were lying about that. That's a hard thing to answer. I mean, there are plenty of people who would say yes. That's not something that I have direct sources on that I could say, you know, without doubt that yes, they knew they were lying. It wasn't accurate, but they were lying. Also remember that in I think February 2001 it was, we started massive bombings of Iraq already. So,
right,
you know,
3 weeks after Bush took the oath.
That's right. So, and, you know, if there were these unmanned, you know, drones and this and that and the other thing, you know, why wasn't that brought up then?
Well, and in fact, in the spring and early summer of 2001, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell both gave statements on the record that anybody can find on YouTube. Maybe I'll try to cue those up here. Saying that, well, we have Saddam Hussein in a box and we've degraded his military far below what it was in 1991 and he doesn't threaten his neighbors and we're just going to keep containing him, basically.
Well, it's not just him either. Everybody knew. It's not like there was doubt. There was no doubt. Every reputable intelligence agency had warned us. Our own intelligence agencies has had debunked every one of the pieces of so-called evidence we had, whether it was the drones or the aluminum tubes, the uranium forgeries, you name it. Our own people shot it down. And yet the Bush administration at every turn would look for that one not remotely credible source they could use to say, aha, but see, this is the intelligence we're going to go with.
Right. And, you know, while the American people were telling each other, basically, you know, doing their Minabird thing from watching TV news, and saying to each other, well, you know, the president has secret information that we don't know about, and so, but we're sure he wouldn't just bluff, and he must be telling the truth and whatever. In fact, it wasn't just the CIA who debunked the aluminum tubes. For one example, it was Knight Ridder. It was Jonathan S. Landay and Warren Strobel and the guys over there at Knight Ridder newspapers. And in fact, even in the Washington Post, and this is something where, you know, if it runs on page A34 in the Washington Post, that's one thing. If it's the top headline that day on antiwar.com, that's not up to their discretion. And so I remember in September of 2002, there was a whole run of stories, including even the Washington Post, that said that every expert at the Department of Energy, at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which is the State Department, CIA, intelligence agency, basically, and most of everybody at the CIA say that these aluminum tubes could not possibly be for centrifuges.
Well, wait a minute. It's not just even that. It's the IAEA. It's British intel. It's MI6, British intelligence. It's German intelligence. I mean, it's really very simple. I mean, let's say you have 20 people telling you that the Earth is round, and you've got one person telling you, well, you know, the Earth is really flat, and that one person has a financial interest, let's say, like the curveball. And at every turn, in every instance where you have 20 to 1, you always pick the one. It's really that simple. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter how many agencies told them. It doesn't matter how many people knew. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. The fact is that at every turn, they chose to go with, you know, for the lack of a better term, the minority report. In this case, you know, the one.
Right.
20 agencies versus international versus the one questionable source. And they did this over and over and over, and that's deliberate.
Yeah.
You may mess up once, but when you do something over and over and over, and it's clear that you're constantly trying to choose something that will fix the facts around your policy, then it's clear that this isn't an accident, that you're deliberately manipulating things in order to write the narrative you need to go to war.
Sure, yeah, especially when you're talking about things like the aluminum tubes that had been publicly debunked in the press around the world for months. 6 months, 7 months before the invasion even started, on the premise that, well, these aluminum tubes must mean that they have a nuclear program. I mean, that to me is especially outrageous, when their bluff has already been called and they still use the same bluff.
Well, I mean, the IAEA basically laughs at the Niger forgeries because there's such obvious forgeries, and yet the same month we attack Iraq. I mean, the IAEA very publicly said, oh my God, this is what you're using to say that, you know, and they pointed out just how absolutely ridiculously and sloppily fabricated it was, and our response, we go to war.
Everybody, it's Anti-War Radio. I'm talking with Larisa Alexandrovna from RawStory. Tell me, who's Ahmed Chalabi?